Okay, so in this video, we're looking at a simple chart, and this chart shows a progression of events. You'll see dates going like this, 1787 to 1861, April 12th. And these are big events in history that show this progression that leads to war, right? And the seeds are sown, the seeds are planted way back in the writing of the Constitution, right? At least I think. Because we can trace this. We can trace this problem of slavery and power and the balance of power in the Senate in Washington, D.C. and government all the way back here, right? When the framers of the Constitution, 1787, they're trying to figure out what did they do about the problem of slavery. You'll remember this from our earlier video on the Constitution. And long story short, they came up with, there was this disagreement between the northern delegates, right? Delegates from northern states and delegates from the states in the South, of what do we do about slavery, right? And they came up with a 3/5 compromise. The southern states wanted to count the slave population as people, even though they didn't consider them to be people, for representation, right? And the North wanted to count them for taxation purposes. They came up with that, so 3/5 compromise meant that each individual slave was really 3/5 of a person, according to the Constitution in the very beginning. So here's where it starts. Well, and then we move to 1820, the Missouri Compromise. We're talking about 1820, the Louisiana Purchase. Has to do with the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson had purchased, Thomas Jefferson, the president, had purchased that area, the Louisiana Purchase, early 1800s, 1803 or 1802, something like that. We'd have to go look, I forget. Well, this Missouri Compromise, it had to do with dividing, eventually, when Congress got around to it, dividing the Louisiana Purchase into free sections and slave parts. Free regions, slave regions. Southern politicians were worried about losing power in the Senate. Again, losing power in the Senate. So they wanted more, this is the politicians from the South, from the slave states, they wanted to have more slave states than free states so they could maintain power. A quick primer, we'll get to government, but just remember how it works, which was set up way back with the Great Compromise when they were writing the Constitution. Right? Virginia Plan, New Jersey Plan. So in the Senate, each state has two representatives, two senators, okay? Each state. We got 50 states now, we got 100 senators, okay? Back then we didn't have 50 states, we had fewer. So if you have, say, 20 states, and 10 of them are free and 10 are slave, and they each have 2 senators, well, that's 20 and 20. 20 senators and 20 senators, they're going to balance each other out, right? Follow me? They're going to balance each other out. Power will be maintained in the Senate. There won't be more senators from free states, so the free states will have more power in the Senate, and there won't be more senators from slave states. So the slave states would have the power in the Senate. And that's what both sides did not want. Free states did not want slave states to have more power in the Senate. Slave states absolutely did not want free states to have more power in the Senate. So the Missouri Compromise was all about dividing equally as they could the territories from the Louisiana Purchase into pretty much equal free and slave regions, right? Dividing into free and slave regions, right? Because it has to do with power in the Senate. 1840, Mexican Secession. After the Mexican War, we talked about that land grab. If you remember our map earlier about the push westward expansion. You'll remember that. And over here was Mexican Secession. It was California and Arizona. Right? A lot of space over here. That was after the Mexican War, 1848, and the Mexican War added a lot of land. Right? It created again bitter disputes between slave states and free states, and slave states were absolutely against adding California as a free state. Absolutely against that. You know, this might come up as a test question. Sometimes it does. Texas is thrown in there, but Texas was already part of the Union. It was 1845 when Texas became part of the Union. But Texas had been part of Mexico. So long story short, if you see a question about Mexican Secession and there's the choice about the annexation of Texas, the answer is probably going to be Mexican Secession because it's the larger picture here. Okay, there's more land. Texas is connected to that because it's after the annexation of Texas. And Texas was once part of Mexico, right? So that's probably the answer on the test question, something about Mexican Secession. But anyway, this was another dispute about power in the Senate and about the balance between free territories and slave territories, all right? Mexican Secession. We don't have to worry about the outcome because the outcome is connected to this, right? I mean, this was the issue. The outcome is connected here, 1850. Compromise of 1850. So all this tension, meaning there's not a separate one, right? It's connected to a big picture. And the big picture is here, Compromise of 1850, which is connected to this, Mexican Secession. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that's not confusing, okay? This was the acquiring new territory. This is our map, if you remember. Can't put a map up here, no space, but if you remember, our map was here, acquiring new territory, all this new territory. And the fight over this was here, 1850, Compromise of 1850. So, what happened? California was added as a free state. It was. But slave states were granted lots of concessions. We don't need to worry about what the concessions were. You're not going to get asked that. It's similar. Another compromise as the country is growing, okay? And this is the theme here that I want you to know. As the country grows, it gets bigger. Missouri Compromise, the Louisiana Purchase, the country's getting bigger. Got to decide, are the territories going to be free or are they going to be slave? As the country gets bigger with Mexican Secession, get a lot of new land over here, more land. Are these new territories going to be free or are they going to be slave? This continued throughout the growth of the U.S., right? Texas was a slave state. So when Texas was admitted, it was a slave state. It was balanced by another state that was a free state to keep power balanced in the Senate, right? And then we get to 1850. Well, also in 1850, but the Fugitive Slave Act, okay? This wasn't about adding territory. This said that and it was all connected to this part, right? This was one of the concessions to slave states, all right? We said there was some concessions. California got added as a slave state. This was as a free state, I'm sorry. Oops. California was a free territory. Free state. The Fugitive Slave Act said that freed slaves who were up in the north, on our map, Massachusetts up here, that were up in the north, they could be caught, they could be apprehended, and they could be taken back to the South and put back into bondage, put back into slavery. And sometimes free African Americans, you know, black folks who were never slaves at all. Sometimes they were caught up, and perhaps you saw the movie 12 years a slave. That was one example of that. This terrible thing. Folks who, I mean, it's terrible either way, but sometimes free African Americans were taken and put into slavery. Right? So that was the Fugitive Slave Act. A lot of people in the North just hated it, so it caused a lot of problems. Right? So tensions are building over time. Okay, they're building, and then we get to the Battle of Kansas, 1856, and we have bloodshed. We have open fighting here between slave supporters, right, supporters of slavery, and people who were against slavery. And there's open fighting, a lot of fighting. Over 200 people died. Right, about 200 people died here in Kansas. More and more problems. Hopefully you see how these tensions build. This issue of slavery that was not settled in the Constitution keeps getting kicked down the road. Missouri Compromise, just we'll deal with slavery later. Compromise of 1850, we'll deal with it later. Well, here we get to 1856 and we have bloodshed. Then we get the Dred Scott decision. It's a Supreme Court decision, Supreme Court case. Arguably, at least from my point of view, the worst Supreme Court case in the history of Supreme Court cases, even worse than Plessy v. Ferguson, which said that segregation was okay. Well, this one said, the Supreme Court said that African Americans weren't even people, that they were property, that slavery was fine. Slavery's okay because African Americans are not people. That's what the court ruled. Most of the justices on the court at the time were from the South. The Chief Justice on the court at the time, his family owned slaves. So, terrible rulings. And it specifically related to the Louisiana Purchase. Remember, here in the middle, to these territories that the Compromise of 1820 was all about, dividing this into free and slave territories. Well, they said that African Americans are not people, so you can't do that. You can't divide it into free and slave territories. That's not going to work. Southerners were very happy about this. Well, at least some of them were, a lot of them were. Northerners feared that the court was going to later say that states could not restrict slavery. Now, the court did not say that at the time, but they were worried that the court was headed that direction. Right? 1859, we have bloodshed again. More bloodshed. Harper's Ferry. It was in Virginia, and one of the leaders here, John Brown, one of the leaders who led this uprising, this fight here, the bloodshed in the Battle of Kansas, he made a raid. He led a group of people, and they raided a federal arsenal, a building that held a lot of weapons, a lot of guns, in Virginia, at this town, this little area called Harper's Ferry. Okay? He wanted to take the weapons and start a slave revolt. He wanted to go to plantations and arm slaves so that they could revolt against plantation owners. And eventually everybody will get free. Right? That was the purpose. That was his intention of this. Right? And people in the South were worried about this hugely, about this idea that there would be future attempts at slave rebellions. Now, he was caught, Brown and his associates, the people with him, they were caught and they were tried, they were executed. So we have two instances of, within just a few years of bloodshed, even before the Civil War, related to slavery, this big dispute over slavery. Then we get to 1860. Lincoln is elected president. It just took Lincoln being elected president. He wasn't even sworn in as president. He just got elected as president. And the southern states started freaking out about this, right? He won without getting any votes at all from states in the South. But he had pledged to not end slavery where it already existed. It doesn't mean that Lincoln supported slavery. It means that he, and publicly, his views, and maybe privately, I mean, from what I've read, he probably was against it the whole time. But certainly publicly, over time, he shifted his views on the issue of slavery. So that, I mean, eventually he issued the Emancipation Proclamation during the war. But before he became president, while he was running, and perhaps because he knew that he wouldn't, or at least he was worried that he wouldn't win, he thought he wouldn't win, he said that, no, we're not going to try to end slavery where it already exists. Southern states didn't buy it, and they were kind of freaking out about this, right? Then we have, right after this, because of all these issues, and really because Lincoln was elected president, South Carolina secedes from the Union. This is end of 1860, beginning of 1861. All right, South Carolina secedes, and then Mississippi goes, Florida goes, Alabama goes, Georgia, Louisiana, and then the state of Texas. And they form the Confederate States of America, and it all happens before Lincoln becomes president. Okay, it all happens before he becomes president, and then he's sworn in. He's sworn in here. And right after he's sworn in, a month after he's sworn in, Confederate forces fire on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was, I suppose is, a federal fort, a Union fort. It was in South Carolina, or is in South Carolina. And there's a harbor there on the coast. A federal fort, and they fire on it, and that starts the Civil War. Right? So this is the big picture context of all these events, how this issue of slavery gets pushed down the road until it just can't be pushed anymore. And then it has to be dealt with, and then we have full-on war. Right? So hopefully that's going to help you see a broad picture, a big picture of how this issue of slavery built over time until it had to be taken care of. And that's when the Civil War starts. All right. So our next video, we're going to look at some of the main events, just a few of the main events that happened in the course of the war. So let's go ahead and get started with that.